An elderly woman approaches the royal guard. What happens next silences the crowd. It was a chilly morning in London, with a soft breeze rolling through the air as tourists gathered in front of Buckingham Palace. Some were chatting excitedly, others were snapping photos, all waiting for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Amidst the crowd, a small elderly woman slowly made her way toward the towering black gates of the palace. She was in her late 80s, dressed in a dark wool coat with a neatly wrapped scarf around her neck. Her frail hands clutched a small, worn photograph, its edges slightly curled from years of being held. She walked deliberately, her steps steady, but there was a certain weight in her movement, as if this moment meant something far greater than just another tourist visit. People barely noticed her at first. The square was buzzing with activity, guides explaining historical facts, children pointing excitedly at the guards, tourists adjusting their cameras for the perfect shot. But as the elderly woman reached the front of the crowd, something shifted. She wasn't holding a phone. She wasn't posing for a picture. Instead, she was simply standing there, staring up at the silent, unmoving royal guard. In her hands, the old photograph trembled slightly, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 memories. The royal guard before her was tall and imposing, his red uniform crisp, his rifle held firmly in place, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The two of them, one frozen in time, the other aged by it, stood just feet apart, but the moment felt as though it spanned decades. A few bystanders began to notice. A middle-aged couple, standing nearby, exchanged glances. A young man lowered his camera, curious about the woman who didn't seem to be there just for the spectacle. Then, slowly, with hands that had seen a lifetime of moments both beautiful and painful, the elderly woman lifted the photograph. She raised it just high enough for the guard to see. Though he didn't move, something about the air shifted. The crowd, still unaware of what was unfolding, continued their quiet chatter. But those who had noticed the woman, those who saw the sorrow, the respect, the longing in her eyes, felt a sudden tightness in their chest. Because somehow, even without a word, it was clear. She wasn't just looking at a soldier. She was looking for someone. At first, most of the crowd remained oblivious to what was happening. They were too busy adjusting their cameras, flipping through guidebooks, or chatting about their travel plans. The guards had always been an attraction, something to watch, admire, and move on from. But a few people had started to notice the elderly woman. A young couple, who had been taking selfies just moments ago, lowered their phones as they caught sight of her standing completely still, holding up the photograph. A group of teenagers, who had been laughing about whether or not the guards ever blinked, gradually fell silent, nudging each other and pointing in her direction. A little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is she standing there like that?" His mother, having just noticed the woman herself, furrowed her brows. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered, watching closely. The air had shifted. There was something about the way the woman held herself, not like a tourist, not like someone trying to provoke a reaction, but like someone standing in front of something far greater than just a monument. More and more people turned their heads, their conversations trailing off into quiet murmurs. "She's holding something," a man near the front said softly, squinting at her hands. A woman with sunglasses lowered them slightly. "It looks like a photograph." The realization spread like ripples in still water. One person noticed, then another, until a small group had stopped talking altogether, their eyes now fixated on the scene unfolding before them. Still, no one knew exactly why she was there. Was she waiting for someone? Had she mistaken the guard for an old friend? Was she lost? The photograph she held trembled slightly in the crisp morning air, but she didn't lower it. She just stood there, staring up at the motionless guard, her face a mixture of something deeply personal, something heavy with memory. The tension grew, but the woman did not seem aware of it. She was in her own world now, a place where time blurred between past and present. And then, before anyone could whisper another question, she did something that sent a hush over the entire crowd. She raised the photograph even higher, as if making absolutely sure that the guard could see it. And that was when everything changed. As the elderly woman lifted the photograph higher, the murmurs in the crowd faded into silence. People who had been distracted by cameras, by conversations, by their own sightseeing plans, stopped what they were doing and turned their full attention to her. She wasn't just another tourist. She wasn't there for the ceremony. There was meaning in her presence, something heavier than curiosity, something that made even the most oblivious passers-by pause. A middle-aged man, who had initially been scrolling through his phone, took off his sunglasses and squinted toward the photo. A woman near him, holding a guidebook, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes softening as she realized what she was seeing. A little boy, still clutching his mother's hand, whispered, "Mom. Who's in the picture?" But his mother couldn't answer. Because she, like everyone else, was staring at the elderly woman's trembling hands, at the faded black and white photograph she held so carefully. The image was old, decades old. Though the details were blurred by time, it was clear enough to make out what was in it. A young man, standing proudly in a Royal Guard uniform. A man who, many years ago, had stood exactly where the soldier in front of her was standing now. A man who, judging by the way she held the picture so delicately, was someone she had never stopped thinking about. Someone she had lost. A quiet gasp came from a woman in the crowd. "Oh my God," she whispered. That must be her husband." The realization spread like wildfire. More people leaned in, trying to get a better look at the photo. The mood shifted entirely. What had once been casual curiosity was now a deep, profound sense of understanding. This wasn't just an old woman looking at a guard. This was a widow standing in front of a memory. A lifetime of longing, of love, of sacrifice, all captured in a single moment. And yet, through it all, the Royal Guard remained still, his rifle gripped tightly, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge her presence, but something about the air around him changed. Those watching closely could see it. A subtle shift in his breathing. The faintest flicker of something behind his stoic expression. He had seen the photograph. And in that split second, though he couldn't show it, though he couldn't speak, he understood. The Royal Guard remained still. His posture was rigid, his hands gripping the rifle with unwavering precision. His training had prepared him for this, to stand like stone, to resist distraction, to never react. And yet, something in the air had shifted. The weight of the moment was undeniable. The elderly woman stood mere feet away, her frail hands still trembling as she held up the faded photograph. She wasn't saying a word, but she didn't need to. The crowd had fallen completely silent. Tourists who had once been focused on taking selfies now lowered their phones. Some even pressed their hands over their mouths, watching in hushed reverence. A young woman in the crowd wiped away a tear, barely able to process the quiet heartbreak in front of her. A man near the front, wearing a British military veteran's pin, stood motionless, his jaw clenched, his eyes glistening. Everyone was waiting to see if the soldier would react. But they knew he wouldn't. The rules were clear: Royal Guards must never break their stance. Never acknowledge distractions. Never move unless commanded. And yet, for those paying close attention, something was different. The guard's breathing had changed. It was slight, so imperceptible that only the keenest eyes noticed. But for a single moment, he seemed to take a slower, deeper inhale. A long, controlled breath, the kind a soldier takes when faced with something far greater than orders. His fingers, which had remained still this entire time, tightened ever so slightly around the rifle. It was a reaction so subtle, so restrained, that most wouldn't have noticed it at all. But the elderly woman did. She looked up at him, her gaze filled with both grief and gratitude. She understood. She knew that deep down, beneath the layers of discipline and duty, this young soldier had seen her pain. And in his own, silent way, he had acknowledged it. A few people in the crowd let out soft exhales, as if they'd been holding their breath without realizing it. A middle-aged woman turned to her husband and whispered, "He knows." The husband nodded solemnly. He knew, too. The soldier couldn't break his stance. He couldn't salute her. He couldn't speak. But in that fleeting moment, His quiet discipline had spoken louder than words ever could. For what felt like an eternity, the elderly woman and the royal guard remained in their silent exchange. She stood, holding her worn photograph, and he stood, gripping his rifle, bound by duty. And yet, in the stillness of that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet understanding, a bridge between past and present. The crowd, once full of casual spectators, had transformed. No one spoke. No one moved. They all stood witness to something much greater than a simple tourist encounter. Then, softly, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice whispered, "That's her husband." Heads turned toward the speaker, a British man in his late 50s, wearing a navy blazer with a small military pin on his lapel. He had been watching the entire time, his expression unreadable. A younger woman beside him furrowed her brows. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hushed. The man motioned toward the photograph still trembling in the elderly woman's hands. "I know that uniform," he said quietly. "That's a royal guard from at least 50 years ago." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. The realization hit them like a wave. The man in the photograph had once stood exactly where the young soldier was standing now. A woman near the front covered her mouth, eyes welling with tears. The elderly woman, still holding the picture, finally closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if allowing a lifetime of memories to flood through her. Then, with the utmost grace, she lowered the photograph and held it close to her heart. And in the next breath, she did something no one expected. She took a single step back. And then, slowly, with deep reverence, she raised her frail hand and gave the royal guard a solemn salute. It was not just a gesture of respect. It was a farewell. The young soldier, still bound by his duty, did not move. But the weight in the air had shifted entirely. A few in the crowd began to quietly wipe away tears. A father pulled his young son closer, whispering something into his ear, perhaps explaining the significance of what had just happened. And then, after holding her salute for a few seconds, the elderly woman nodded, turned, and began walking away. The crowd parted for her, allowing her to leave in dignified silence. She had come here not as a tourist, not as a spectator, but as a woman visiting the ghost of a memory. And now, she was ready to go. As she disappeared into the streets of London, the royal guard remained standing, unshaken, unwavering, yet forever marked by the moment. And for those who had witnessed the silent exchange, one thing was certain. They had just seen something they would never forget.